Welcome to this evening's Alumni Professional Networking event. I'm James Davis, Head of Alumni Relations at UCL, and this event is part of an award-winning series aimed at helping alumni such as yourselves with career aspirations and routes to a successful career. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to make a quick mention that this is just one of several avenues that the Alumni Network provide for alumni who are wanting help with careers. And I want to make a special mention of our Alumni Careers Mentoring Network, where over 300 experienced alumni have volunteered to give one-on-one time to help alumni and current students with careers, informal careers guidance. So please, if you want to use the Careers Mentoring Network, either speak to a member of the Alumni Relations team or visit our website. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor John Mullan, who is head of UCL's English department and is going to chair this evening's eminent panel. John needs little introduction. He's a regular radio broadcaster, he's a literary journalist, and he was also a judge for the 2009 Man Booker Prize. So, John Mullan, everyone.
Thanks very much. I'm the stooge to the stars this evening. And I want to leave as much time as possible for your questions. So I will try and cut down all my contributions to the minimum. I'd like to introduce you to the stars, my panel. On my far right is Ken Follett, novelist, best-selling novelist. Those two words which so rarely come together. But do with Ken, who is also living proof of the fact that a degree in philosophy is an avenue to worldly success. N'est-ce pas? Because Ken is, of course, a former student of philosophy at UCL. On my immediate right is Alexandra Pringle, who was once a student of English at UCL and who's now editor-in-chief at Bloomsbury, and started off, I hope I'm right about it, started off at Virago. And didn't you edit those Virago modern classics? I mean, once upon a time, I used to buy those just because of the sort of livery. I didn't worry about what the title of the author was. I just had to. So that's the kind of thing a publisher wants readers to do. Yeah. And then on my immediate left is Joanna Briscoe, who was also an English student at UCL, and has something, of course, in common with Jane Austen. I'm sure you all know that, which is not just literary talent, but actually having had one of her novels adapted by Andrew Davis, who also did English at UCL once upon a time. And her latest novel is called You, and has been published quite recently? Yeah. July. Okay, and on my far left is Luigi Bonomi, who is another English graduate of UCL and who is an agent and has his own literary agency, but has also a career in publishing behind him. He said that if I mention the fact that he was once, what's editor-in-chief? No.
No.
What? You're
Where?
one? Sorry?
Where?
Penguin.
As editorial director.
Editorial director at Penguin. Having said that, I can now reveal that not only did he work for Mills and Boon, but he met his wife there. Which I think, he didn't want me to say that, but I think makes us all really like him, personally. Now, what I've asked each member of my panel to do is just to start with, just if each one maybe would speak just for 5 minutes or even less, just to say something about the lessons that their lives in writing or publishing or book selling have, the lessons that those lives have taught them. And then I hope that will leave as much room and time as possible for questions. I should warn you in advance that Ken has to leave a bit earlier than everybody else, so about 7:30. So when he stalks out, it is not at all a protest on his part. Okay, so would you like to start, Ken?
Yes, sure, by all means. How to get your book published? The short answer is to write a good one, and that's not entirely facetious. If you write something wonderful, then the overwhelming likelihood is that it will be recognised by people in the book world, people like those of us here on this panel, it'll be recognised and celebrated and published. However, it makes life easier to have contacts. And in my own case, I was working as a newspaper reporter in 1973 when a colleague of mine wrote a thriller and got it published. And I went to the launch party for the book and met his publisher and said to his publisher, I'm writing a thriller too. And the publisher said, I'd love to read it. Why don't you send it to me? I said, it isn't finished yet. He said, doesn't matter. I'll send it to me and I'll tell you whether to bother finishing it or not. And he did publish it. And it was not a bestseller. It was not a very good book, but it was good enough to publish. And I thought, well, maybe if I work a bit harder next time, I'll write a better book. So I did have contacts, and it always helps. But it can easily happen the other way. I'm represented by an agency called Writers House in New York. And when I joined them, it was one man and an assistant. It's now the biggest literary agency in the world, not just because of me, I hasten to add. They have many popular writers. And the girl, she was a girl then, who was the assistant in the 70s, is now the boss. And about 10 years ago, she received in the post a typescript which she glanced at and gave to her assistant, saying, take this home tonight and read it and tell me what you think. The assistant, Jody, came back the next morning and said, I think it's really good, and I'd like to be the agent for it. Now, that's how it happens in literary agencies and in publishing houses a lot of the time, too. You work for somebody as an assistant for a few years, and then you get a chance to try and do as well as the boss. So Jody became the agent for this book, and she made a 3-book deal with an American publisher for $750,000. The author's name was Stephanie Meyer, and the book was called Twilight. And the year that the movie of Twilight came out, there were by then 4 Twilight books, and they were numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the bestseller list. And Stephanie Meyer got a royalty check for $38 million. We don't normally know each other's royalties, by the way, but that one is famous because the publisher's computer couldn't print a check for that much money and had to be reprogrammed, and somehow that story went all around. Some things to note about that the Stephanie Meyer story. One, it does still sometimes happen that way now, and it does sometimes happen that an unknown author mails the typescript, and it gets, the Americans say over the transom. It came in over the transom. That means it was an unknown author, it was an unsolicited manuscript, and it was a wonderful book and it got published. That sometimes happens. Second thing to note, didn't happen in a publishing house. It happened in a literary agency. A lot of publishers now do not read unsolicited manuscripts. They put your typescript back into the stamped addressed envelope, and they send it right back to you without reading the first page. And if you don't send them a stamped addressed envelope, they throw it in the bin. However, literary agents are hungrier than publishers, and they now do that work of looking at unsolicited manuscripts a lot of the time. So you've got a much better chance if you mail your book to an agent than if you mail your book to a publisher. 3, note that it was the assistant who discovered Stephanie Meyer. And our business, our world, is still full of young people who are desperate to make their name by finding a completely unknown author who's really good and getting that author published. That is the quickest way to improve your status and salary in the book world. Number 4, notice that Jody made a 3-book deal for Stephanie Meyer, even when Stephanie Meyer was a completely unknown author who had never sold a book in her life. A publisher doesn't really want a book. A publisher wants an author. So it's important to emphasize when you talk to somebody or write to somebody about the book you've written that you have already started writing your second novel and you have a couple of ideas for the 3rd and 4th novels, because publishers have to invest a lot of effort and a certain amount of money in a first-time author, and they want to be able to think that they might be earning money from this author, not just from one book, but for some years to come. And finally, point 5 is what I started off saying. Of course, Twilight was a wonderful book. It was wonderfully well written. It had a fabulous romance. Its appeal, particularly to teenagers, was terrific. Terrific magnetism. It was a wonderful book. Now, I've talked about writing something wonderful. And so finally, let me say what I mean by something wonderful. Almost always, a successful book is one that engages the reader emotionally. You have to make them care about the characters you've created and what happens to those characters. If you do that, the book will be a success, even if it has many faults. And let's face it, most novels have lots of faults as well as good qualities. But if it engages the readers, it will almost certainly be a success. And if it doesn't engage readers emotionally, it will be a very difficult book to sell, to publish and to sell.
Thanks very much. Alexandra? Oh.
I'd just like to find out a little bit about you before I start talking. I'd like to know whether you are wanting to write and publish or whether you want to work in the publishing industry. So people who are writing and want to be writers, put your hands up. All of you. That's really, really interesting. And is there anyone who's looking to get jobs in the publishing industry? Well, that says a great deal,
some would
doesn't
like
it?
both. Belt and braces.
That's very, very interesting. So really what you want to know is, in terms of my experience, how to get published rather than how to be a publisher. So I will address that. As Ken said, publishers no longer, on the whole, look at unsolicited manuscripts. And I think the main reason for that is the advent of email. You don't so much get manuscripts through the post with a stamped addressed envelope or without one. You get them sent by email. Agents use email. In the old days, an agent would have to photocopy the manuscript and send it to the editor, which means photocopying it, putting it in a jiffy bag, taking it down the road to the post office. They had to charge the cost of that on the whole to the author, so they would be pretty circumspect about how many people that they would submit a manuscript to. They'd think very carefully, and they would maybe send it to one editor at a time or 2 or 3. But now, all an agent has to do, for no cost to the author or him or herself, is do a covering letter and send it out, one press of the button, to every publisher there is. So that, for example, at Bloomsbury, where I work, there are 2 of us who are fiction editors. Others do a bit of fiction, but that's sort of mainly the balance. And we have no other imprints. So, for example, if it's Jonathan Cape or Chatto, they're owned by Random House. So there's a little spread. But at Bloomsbury, we get everything. And so just from the agents alone, we are sometimes receiving, say, 10 submissions a day. And on the run up to Frankfurt, you might get 40 manuscripts in one day for submission. So if you think of that, and then you think of unsolicited on top of that, you can't physically possibly read it, because we also have to publish. And we do our reading at nights and at weekends. We don't do it during the day, because during the day we go about the very complicated and time-consuming business of publishing a book. And when you're called an editor, you don't just sit and edit a book, you publish it, which means that you work on the jacket, the copy, the advance information sheets, you communicate with the sales department, the marketing department, the publicity department, you see it through production, you oversee every single step of the way. An editor is the engine that pushes the book through, and you can never let go of it. So that's what you're doing in the day. You're going to lots of meetings, and literary agents rather pityingly say, you poor thing, you have so many meetings. I mean, I personally like the meetings a great deal because they're about the business of publishing books, but they're very time-consuming. So if you want to be a reader, I mean a writer, not a reader. If you want to be a writer, you need to think very carefully about who is going to be your champion, and that first person is going to be your literary agent. And you have to have a literary agent. The only other way round is if you happen to have friends who can get you in the right direction. Like a very famous writer who we published said, my godson has just written a novel. Would you read it? And of course you say, I'll read it. You know, so that was a very quick way through. But on the whole, you know, unless you're the godson of a very famous writer, you're going to have to, first of all, find a literary agent. And what you need to do is not just send out things to literary agents without knowing who they are. You need to think about the lists of every agent and whether they have comparable books, whether they have writers that you think are in some way akin to yours. So you really have to do research, and you have to do research by reading the Writers and Artists Yearbook, by going to bookshops, by going on Amazon, and trying to slot in where you are, what your aspirations are, who you would want to be compared to, and then try and get a literary agent who is on the same wavelength as you. And it's the literary agent who will know who the editors are who are most suitable for you. And that's the really important thing that an agent does, is they do the dating. They're the date masters. So, you know, instead of it being a blind date, it's a date with a proper introduction and with a proper sense. And if a literary agent is very good, on the whole, they'll call you and say, I have this book, this is the author, and chat you up about it a bit. And you absolutely know if you're getting a letter that's just basically been sent off to 25 people and it's not tailored to you in any way. And it's the same if you're trying to find a literary agent. It's really worth knowing what their lists are like, who the other people are, so that you can, you know, you can present yourself properly. And Luigi will obviously go into the detail of that. But all I can say is if you want to get published, you have to have an agent. And then the next thing is that when you get a publisher, that your relationship with the publisher is incredibly important. And that's not just with your editor, it's with various key people across the company. And finally, when you publish, it's not just handing it over to the publisher, and as Joanna will say, we make you work very hard, and it's very tough, and often writers aren't used to that, going out into the world and explaining themselves and talking about their work, and it's tough, but it has to be done because it's really hard publishing, particularly fiction. Because you don't have a ready-made audience. If you're writing a non-fiction book about Chinese history in the 6th century, there will be people who will find their way to it, who will be specialists. But to get a novel noticed is one of the hardest things in the world, and the publisher has to work very hard for that, and so does the writer.
Thank you very much. Joanna.
Okay, well, as someone who's been writing and publishing for, I think, about 20 years, I do think that you come to this at possibly the toughest time in terms of fiction. I don't know if my colleagues would agree. It is incredibly tough out there, so you have to be incredibly disciplined in a number of ways, which I will attempt to go through. On the other hand, in some ways, I think it's easier to publish a first novel. I think long-term careers are more difficult at the moment, but you know, publishers are always looking for a big new novel. What I would say, first of all, is you just have to write a good novel, and in a way not think about the publishing process. And I've taught at Birkbeck and Arvon a few times, where really what they all want to know about is publishing, and you know, can they meet my agent and this. And what I always say is it's not about that. It really is about just trying to write the very best novel that you can. And unless you are writing pure genre, I think you shouldn't keep too much of an eye on the market out there. I think you have to write what you want to write. What the thing I'm aware of when I'm writing is that I don't want to bore my reader. So although I'm writing about what I want to write about, I'm also wanting some sense of the page turning. So I think if there's any time at which I'm getting very slightly bored, I think my reader's going to get a hell of a lot more bored. And so I will go back and cut or remove that altogether. So that's the way where I do keep an eye on the reader. But I think generally you've just got to write a good novel. In fact, you know, there's that famous question, why are you here tonight? Why aren't you writing? And I think if you come to a thing like this, you should pay back the time by writing for at least an hour tonight. And the other thing at the beginning stage is to get beyond the autobiographical. It really is. Because even if you should be writing about what you know about, you know, there is an argument to say that it's all about transforming the autobiographical or the political or whatever into fiction, and that process is a very, very hard one, and one that is learnt, I think, over time. I also think in this difficult market that you do have to be very disciplined about plot. A surprising number of people can write a good sentence. You know, it's you may be disappointed to hear, but there are an awful lot of good prose writers out there, and you know, we writers feel quite precious about our prose. That's part of it. But honestly, it's the characterisation and the plot and the structure that you need to be thinking about very, very strongly, first of all, not just can you write a beautiful description, because that's not going to get you very far. You know, that's a good thing to have, but it has to be applied to the basic bones. I also think that the editing process is just so vital in a way that you can only understand when you've written a whole draft and then written however many drafts you're going to write. You are going to have to redraft and redraft, and then, you know, I'm talking about getting it ready to send it to an agent, and I think don't approach an agent until you've written, you know, a lot of drafts. Being very, very strict with yourself. I use a team of novel doctors, as I call them, who are friends, who are good readers or editors before I even approach my agent with my novel. You know, I really get it to a level where I'm relatively happy with it. And then, of course, he'll suggest things, and then my publisher will make me do, you know, maybe 2 more drafts or whatever. I think my last novel went through about 20 drafts. So, and the other thing I'd say is don't get distracted by this era where people say, oh, well, you can just write a blog. You know, yes, it's good to write a blog, but an absolute minority will catch the attention of a publisher. I think too many people focus on that, spend too much time basically talking to their friends. So you know, I think a blog can be the equivalent of Facebook or whatever, and fine, do it, but actually focus on the writing rather than just hoping someone's, you know, going to discover you online. And then it is about finding the right agent, which is something Luigi will talk about. Again, contacts are very important, but most people don't start out with contacts. I'm always very proud that, you know, I came to UCL with absolutely no contacts at all, and you know, I had to do it myself. And in fact, the way I did it, I was quite pragmatic. I got an agent by writing a very mundane non-fiction book after having done quite a lot of journalism, because obviously you're also going to have to do something else. For God's sake, don't leave your job. And there's also the rule that, you know, less is more, and I think the more time you have in some ways, the more problematic it can actually be. And you can always write in the evenings, in your lunch hour. You can do it with a full-time job. It's difficult, but you can do it. And you know, if you work at it, the contacts will come. So, for instance, I got a contract for a non-fiction book about 3 years after I'd done lots and lots of freelance journalism. That contact was Luigi Bonomi sitting beside me because we were in the same English department. And through that, I then got an agent. I then changed agents, but of course it was easier getting a second agent. And I was basically working on my first novel for years and years and years while writing journalism to make a living. And most people I know, I think, have put kind of a good decade into it, is the truth. Not, you know, not everyone. Some people write the first novel in a couple of years and get it published, but I think it's more common to put years and years and years into work. And you know, you don't need flashy tricks. You don't. If you've got the right agent, they will, we hope, find the right publisher But you know, I just say to you, get it as good as you can. Don't think it'll solve your life being published. That's the other thing. It won't. You know, you can kind of put off your life, I think, waiting for that magic moment you get published and it's going to cure everything. And of course it doesn't. It's a lovely thing, but you know, it doesn't solve everything. So I'd also say go out there and live a bit, and then just write the best novel you can.
Luigi, everybody agrees that you're the one that everybody
Okay, we're a small agency, there's 6 of us in our agency, of which 3 of us are agents, the rest are support staff. We receive 5,000 manuscripts a year. That's about 100 a week, roughly, 100 a week. Of the 5,000 a year, we will work with about 10 a year. So those are the odds. Now, they're not bad odds. You know, they're not bad odds, because you should see the stuff that comes in. How then do we pull out those 10 and quickly get rid of the others? And I would say that there are several things that really immediately come to our attention. Like Alexandra said, we're bombarded with work. We've got our own authors to look after. We have a company to run. We're constantly looking for new writers. We are looking for new writers, but we have a very short amount of time that we can actually devote to each manuscript. So it's really got to hit us between the eyes very quickly. Very quickly. We have not got time to read the whole novel. We make up our mind within 2 to 3 pages of that book. Maybe a bit more than that. Maybe if we like the 2 to 3 pages, we'll read a bit more, first chapter and so on. But those 2 to 3 pages will tell us an awful lot. As will your submission letter, as will a synopsis. So what are we looking for? I think, and I'm talking from very much a commercial fiction perspective, that plot is everything. That yes, you have to be able to write. Clearly you have to be able to write. But if you can, as Joanna said, you can write the most polished prose, but if you haven't got a good plot, forget it. You know, plot is everything. And a plot idea is not a plot. It's just a good plot idea. You know, and very often we get that this is a story about, and it's a terrific plot idea, and then you start reading it, but the novel falls apart because the plot hasn't been worked out. It's not true to itself. So the first thing I would say to you is, what is this novel about? What is the plot? Is it going to engage the reader immediately? The novel must also be true to itself. That's a very, very common mistake that we find a lot. That a novel sets out to be one type of novel and becomes something else. You know, because the author has got bored with their storyline, or they don't know where to take it. You know, we had a novel very recently. Luckily, we sold it, and we believed in it. The first half was fantastic. The second half was a disaster. Now, I worked like a lunatic on the second half, and whereas before it was 5 out of 10, it moved up to 6 out of 10, despite the work that I put into it. But the first half was terrific. And the reason for that, and it was sold, and the publisher will now do a lot of work on the author on the second half. The problem with that was that the author, having set up a terrific premise, then got very fascinated by the characters that he'd created and went off into their journeys, those particular characters. Wasn't it great that this character then did this, then did that? Where was the plot? The plot got lost. So the novel has got to be true to itself. If it's a thriller, it's got to be a thriller all the way through. Yes, it can have other elements, but that's the primary thing that you're selling. The other thing, as Ken put it quite rightly, you've got to identify with a character. You've got to feel for the character. It can be an anti-hero. You might want to hate this character, but secretly you love to hate that character. You've got to really want to follow that character. If you don't, why bother reading? I would urge you to open in scene, open immediately, open with an opening that is immediate and that will grab the reader's attention. If you don't want to start off by saying, you know, it was a hot summer's day in central London, in Gower Street, and then we have 5 pages of what the pigeons were doing in Gower Street. You know, it's got to, because by then I'm bored, get rid of it. You know, it's got to open immediately. Write short chapters, because people increasingly have short attention span. And as Joanna put it, pacing is everything. You know, plot, chapter endings create, strong chapter endings create a sense of pace. They make you have page turners, they make you want to turn the story through, and you feel that you're getting more excited than you're with it. Those are the primary things, you know, and don't send a submission to an agent saying, I've written this novel, it's a thriller, but I'm also submitting a book of poetry, a love story, and a play for Radio 4. Because that, and we get that a lot, because immediately you think, well, what does that tell us? It tells us that you're not focused, that you're just throwing the junk at us, and so the junk comes back. You know, I'm sorry to say that, but that's how it appears. It really should be focused. It's a business. You're in the business of getting published. And therefore, deal with it like a business. Be as professional as you possibly can. Don't send your manuscript with staples all over it and devices that, you know, you lock your finger off when you try to open it. Because that puts you off. It really does. You know, a simple elastic band. Single, you know, double spaced, one side, not on facing sides, not single spaced, so it's hard to read. What's that about? Saving paper? You know, so think of it like a real business. Make it clear, be focused, a simple submission letter that sets out what you're trying to do and something about yourself, and that's it. Don't elaborate too much about the novel. Let the agent read it. If you tell the agent in your submission letter the whole plot of the novel, he might choose to reject it there and then. You know, just make it a simple précis of what that novel is about, and then drive on to the first page. The first page is immediate, it's vivid, it's well written, and that will drive them to the second page, the third page, and then you're off. In terms of agents, I think Alexandra was absolutely right. You've got to be very careful who you send your manuscript to. You really have got to do the research. You know, we are particularly known for very commercial fiction. We're now actively looking very much for, you know, book club reads, which is the whole Richard and Judy phenomenon, and literary commercial. That vein is really popular at the moment. So as agents, we're desperately looking for that. If you were to write an experimental novel, as we get all the time, about, you know, how a character stuffs an hippopotamus and sells it in Camden Market, that's not for us. You know, so, but it might be for another agent. You know, there are lots of agents who might think that's terrific. Not for us. You know, so let's be really clear about what kind of agent you're aiming at. Do you want to be on that agent's list? You know, do you value what they're doing? Do you think it would be a great fit? And if so, send it to that agent. Now, if you get rejected, don't worry too much. If 6 months later you have another novel, you might have several novels on the go, you can still send it to that agent. Then we do keep logs of which manuscript we've received, but we don't cross-reference on those logs. We haven't got time. So we can't say, oh, did we get this manuscript from somebody? Has he sent us something else before? We haven't got time to do that. So for us, it's a brand new submission. And I would send your manuscript out to a number of literary agents at the same time. There used to be a convention that you would send the manuscript out to one agent and wait for a reply. Don't bother with that. Send it out to all of them, to the ones you think are going to be right for you, and then wait for a reply. And the reply could take as long as 3 months, you know, because there's a lot of manuscripts to read and a lot to process. So just be patient with that. But a writer is someone who writes, and as Joanna said, most of the people, we've been really lucky. This year we've had 6 new novelists published, which is terrific given our size, and you know, and every year we're always finding new authors. But most of those authors have worked on their novels for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, at least. They really have worked them through and edited them and have seen it as, you know, and haven't taken their best friend. You know, that's another one. I cannot bear a letter coming through saying my best friend says it's the most fantastic thing. Because that was just so immature. So, you know, let's just be very focused. But as Ken said and as Alexandra said, agents out there now are desperate to find the next big novel. And new novels are selling for large sums of money. It's a tough market, but everyone is after that big novel that they hope will save their publishing in Brent, or save the literary agent's business. We're all looking for it, so it's not a bad time.
Thanks very much. Okay, I thought for questions, I hope we'll have plenty of questions, and I thought if it was okay, it might be a good idea to try taking them in pairs rather than having one question and everybody tries answering. So if we take more than pairs, I'll forget what the questions are. But could we? Who would like to ask a question, please? Yes.
Yes. Hello. I just wanted to know, in terms of publishing and also Luigi, do you find that books that you're putting forward are getting rejected now that would not have been rejected a couple of years ago, perhaps? And in terms of the publishing, do you find that you're not taking as many chances, you're being very, very much more careful?
Okay, we'll have one more and then we'll... Yes, please?
Is the process for non-fiction very different?
Ah, okay. So is it a more conservative time than in the past?
I think that it is more conservative in general in the publishing world. And it's fascinating that, although the thing that strikes me is that everybody's running after very few things and they're going berserk. I mean, 2 weeks ago, a novel was sold, a first novel, which I have to say I thought was so badly written, an Australian novel, was
the
sold.
Lighthouse.
Yes, the Lighthouse one.
Not one of mine. I wish it had been.
However badly written.
It sold for £320,000, and there was a higher offer from someone else in the UK and 1.25 million in the US. And we were all completely gobsmacked about that. So what you have is everybody rushes after one thing, and then other people get completely overlooked. At Bloomsbury, we do a lot of debuts. We publish a lot of debuts. We believe very much in fostering talent. We're on the whole on the more literary side. There we have sort of real crossover, literary commercial. But when we buy an author, we buy an author, not a book, in terms of fiction. So we're looking for the long term. So, for example, we are lunatics, but we're doing 3 collections of short stories next year, and nobody publishes short stories, and short stories don't sell. But we happen to believe very passionately that these writers are worth nurturing for the future. So everybody is different, but I think the general climate is conservative. I also think that the biggest problem is for people mid-career, that if their sales have started going down, and that's happening with an awful lot, their publishers spit them out now, whereas 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they were kind of signed up for life, and that's not the case anymore. So a lot of people hit the rocks sort of a bit into their career. I think that's the hardest time of all.
Anybody else have any thoughts about the conservative?
I think it's very tough, yeah. We've had novels that, 3 years ago we would have sold, aren't selling. But when people are buying, just like Alexandra said, the money's very high. So it's quid pro quo, isn't it? You've got to be very careful about which one you send out. It's got to be as best as it possibly can. You can't get away with things.
No.
It can't be a list filler. That doesn't exist anymore. The mid-list is gone. The idea of a publisher publishing a book which they would hope to sell 20, 30,000 copies in the first print run. I mean, now 20, 30,000 copies is a pretty good sale.
It's always been good, as far as I'm concerned.
Those days are pretty gone. I mean, people they want it out in big time, so it is very much harder. Yeah, very much harder.
And what about I fear that's probably
How different is non-fiction?
Yes, non-fiction.
Well, non-fiction is not different in that everything has to be as good as it can possibly be. But you can sell a non-fiction book on a synopsis and sample chapters and really well worked. And you cannot spend enough time on the synopsis. And, to think that you can rush something off and do 2 or 3 pages, and that's absolutely no good. You can sometimes spend 6 months. Well, I was an agent for 4 years, and there's a young woman who came to see me who was doing her MPhil. And she was called Amanda Foreman, and she sat down and she told me the story of her thesis, which was the life of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire. And I gave her, talked to her about how the synopsis should be. And she went away and she took 6 months writing it. And I auctioned it, and 8 people bid, and it was, a huge success. But 8 people bid because the synopsis was dazzling. And that's the important thing. Whereas with a novel, you have to write your first novel. You have to write the whole thing. You can't just send in a few pages or a few chapters. Really, you've got to be so serious about it. And as Joanna said, it has to be as good as it can possibly be. So that's the big difference in terms of selling.
Because Ken has to go very soon. So if there are any questions which might specifically be addressed to...
It's for actually both the authors. I'm curious about your revision process. Once you have that first draft down, how much do you edit yourself, and how much do you rely on the input of other people before you start really showing it around? How does that work for you? I'm just curious.
Well, I do huge amounts of editing as I'm going, but I usually still end up with far too much. So my last novel, I literally cut about 50,000 words out of it. And then, it felt cross that I'd written so much, but it needed cutting. So, and I think I rely on myself to do a certain amount, and certainly as I'm going. And actually, with that one, because it was just so big, I said to someone else, okay, here's a pen, do it. And I was horrified when it came out. I went, it's a decimated novel. And she said, no, it's not, you'll see it's better. And it was.
And was that a friend or?
Yeah.
Okay, someone you trust.
Someone I trust, yes. I think a good intelligent reader you can find someone who's not biased. I've always found friends who aren't necessarily professional. We can do this.
What about you, Ken?
I'm working 3 stages, and typically each stage takes about 8 months. I spend 8 months writing the outline, 8 months on the first draft, and 8 months on the rewrite, roughly. And the key editing process comes after the first draft. I show my first drafts to 3 kinds of people. Professional editors, so I have an editor in London, an editor in New York, and my agent, my New York agent, happens to be a terrific editor. His name's Al Zuckerman. And he is really able to help me improve my book. So professionals, I show it to friends and family. I have 1 or 2 friends who really enjoy reading my first drafts and make perceptive comments. My kids, well, some of my kids read my first drafts, others are not very interested. And my wife Barbara always reads my first drafts and makes good comments. And then I usually show the first draft to several experts, often historians, but sometimes scientists or police officers who check the background detail for errors, and there always are errors. So then I have notes from about 12 people on my first draft, and so I take chapter by chapter, I collate the notes so that every note I get from somebody applies to a particular page, and then I have folders. Boring stuff, isn't it? I have folders, so when I'm rewriting as I was today, on the right-hand side I have the page for my first draft, on the left-hand side I have a page of notes from people. And I rewrite completely, I don't edit, I retype everything, rekey everything, and try to make changes that take account of things that people have said. And nearly always the things that people say are worth listening to. I mean, it's very rare that I look at a comment from somebody and say, well, that's just crap, I'm not going to take any notice of it. But here's the thing. People can find fault, but you generally have to decide what to do about it. And even professional editors, today, for example, I had a note from an editor, I won't say who said, the beginning of this chapter is dull, why don't you shorten it? Now that's never the answer. If a chapter is dull, the answer is never to shorten it, because then you've just got a short, dull chapter. And it's also, but you have to think of this, because mostly they can't tell you what to do. If the material is dull, if the chapter is dull, it means that you haven't handled the material in such a way as to bring out the drama. Obviously, you decided this chapter was going to be about this, and so you thought it was interesting, fascinating, and dramatic, and you've done something wrong. And you've got to look at it again and say, okay, typically there's a lot of information here. Too much information. Don't shorten the amount of information. Look at each paragraph and say, how does this information affect the hopes and fears of the character? Maybe this paragraph makes him or her, maybe it reinforces their hopes and they feel good about it. Then there's another paragraph, more information, and that inflames their fears. Then it's dramatic, and you can do that. You can give people as much information as you like, as long as it's dramatic. So that's just an illustration of how comments people make on the first draft are really important, but you have to actually solve the problem yourself. And then, so I do a second draft, and the second draft also goes to a lot of the same people, but generally speaking, unless something's gone very badly wrong, generally speaking, the second draft only then has to be tweaked. It's small stuff. I send it to all the, to the police officer and the scientist and the history professor, but there's generally not so much. Small amount, and then I make those changes in a matter of a couple of weeks, and then I have the final draft. That's my rewriting.
Thank you.
Yes?
So do you actually have any advice for the actual writing process? Like if someone's stuck in a writer's block or something, anything you do to write?
You know what Dr. Johnson said? Sexist way of putting it, so you'll have to pardon that. He said, any man may write if he set himself doggedly to it. Obviously no sympathy for that in the audience, but
I walk around, apparently, I didn't know this until my wife Barbara pointed it out to me, and if somebody new comes to work at our house, as a cleaner or something, Barbara says, if you see him walking around and he stares at you as if he really hates you, don't take any notice, he's just thinking about his book. And so apparently that's what I do. Apparently I walk around the house and glare at people. I'm not conscious of this, and I do that until I've solved the problem.
Do you have a sort of person for you as well, Joanne? Do you have a thing like, famously that Trollope would have? He would literally have a sort of target output for the day, and that's what he would hit, and he would work for in certain periods of the day, and he would aim for a certain wordage, and and that was his way of sort of getting around the notion, really, that writing was sitting around waiting to be inspired. That he was quite sort of disdainful of that idea. Do you have targets like that?
Well, I think all professional authors know that writing isn't about waiting around, waiting to be inspired, because you wouldn't really write anything. I try to have targets, and then, to be completely honest, I don't meet them. One day it'll be hours, and the next day it'll be word length. So much else goes on in life that that is difficult, particularly if you have children. But I think you have to try and set yourself certain targets.
What about you?
Well, I start at 7 o'clock and finish at 5 usually, and if I write 1,500 words, that's a decent day's work. If 1,000, it's been a slow day, and more than that, and I'm deliriously happy. That's the first draft. Yeah. Then the rewriting is obviously faster.
I think it's horses for courses as well. I think I've got a lot of authors who do have a timetable. They find that really, really useful. Office hours, maybe if they're not working, but even those who are working get up at 5 a.m. I've got one who gets up at 5 a.m. Writes for 2 hours until 7:30, 3 hours till 8, and then gets the children ready to go to school. But she's done 3 hours work every morning.
Yeah.
I think that's enough.
May I comment compassionately for the person on writer's block? I've been a professional writer for over 30 years, and I don't experience it anymore. I would just simply say, if you have writer's block, read something really, really good. Read something either that inspires you and encourages you, or that gets you so angry that you feel you must despair.
That's very funny. As an academic, and we're all slightly like Iago academics, really. I used to do exactly the opposite. Whenever I despaired, because I thought this is rubbish, I'm producing rubbish, I would go into the academic bookshop in the university town where I was and pick almost at random the latest product of the university press, open it at random, start reading the desiccated prose in front of me, and leave with a happy trip in my stride. But maybe that's a rather specialised genre.
Read something rotten.
Yeah.
Better than this.
Yeah. What about you, sir? And then.
Okay. Luigi, could you be my agent now?
I'm going to read it.
Basically, I was wondering if I could get some advice, because I have written a book, and I've written a letter as well, submission letter, but it's the synopsis which is troubling me, because there's like a lot of background to the actual plot that the reader then sort of finds out as they read along the book. Like they'll start picking up the actual the background. And what would you advise in the synopsis? Should I just send something like, this is the background to the book and then the plot, or should I?
There's a temptation to not even include it and let the agent go straight to the manuscript. If you have faith in your manuscript, let them go straight to the manuscript. I mean, basically a synopsis is there to give an indication of what type of book it is and where the story is going. It's a good indication of where the story is going. If the story is set at, there's a backdrop that has 10 pages of backdrop before we come to the premise of the story, that's not very enticing.
I can't bear reading synopsis for fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, really can't bear it. I will, obviously for non-fiction, as I said earlier, they're very important. But for fiction, it's all in the book. It's all in the writing. It's all in the first few pages. And a good letter, which gives a little description of what the book is helpful. As it is when you're receiving a letter from an agent. I mean, I got a letter from an agent about 9 months ago, and it was about this novel which we've just published called The Song of Achilles, which is the first novel, and he described how it was set in the classical world and narrated by Patroclus about the life of Achilles. And actually, because my son had just been doing classical civilization MA at UCL, I was struck by it, and so I put it to the top of my pile. I mean, these things are so random, and preempted the book, and it's being a huge success. But that was all encapsulated in a well-written letter. A synopsis would have bored me rigid, and I don't want people to tell me what the plot is. I want to find that out for myself.
So really, I was thinking about the synopsis. I found myself thinking, what great sort of masterwork of literary history would have a synopsis that would tell you it was a great, and it's very difficult. It's a book about trying to catch a whale. not for the squeamish. Yes, sir.
I think Alexandra's partly answered this question already, but while the great novel which will sweep the world is taking shape, if I'm writing a few short stories in the meantime, is there anything useful I can do with them?
Yes, you can put them in for the Sunday Times short story competition, and in fact we have 2 writers that have come out of that, which is really interesting. There are magazines, very few, but there are. And also radio look for short stories, so that there are openings, not as many as in America, but there are. What would you say, Luigi?
I agree. I think the competitions and the magazines. I think maybe short stories are beginning to come back, certainly on. And the other thing, there's a whole other debate going on about e-book publishing, but I think short stories are slowly coming back. But
another idea would be to try and link them. And they're
Catcher in the Rye style.
Oh, it's a long time since I read Catcher in the Rye. I was thinking of novel that won, a collection of short stories that won the Pulitzer Prize recently called Olive Ketteridge, by an American writer. And they're linked, there are, all these short stories are set in the same town, and some of the same characters appear in the same story. There are a lot of people who struggle, a lot of actually very good writers who struggle with a full-length novel. And a solution to their problem is often to write a lot of stories that are linked in that way. And that can be, to read, I find that can be as satisfying as a novel in a slightly different way.
Helen Simpson does that.
Helen Simpson, we have a debut from Sri Lanka. She's British Sri Lankan, and they're all set in South London in the 1980s, and all the characters go in and out of each other's stories, and it's absolutely wonderful and does give you the satisfaction of a novel. And indeed, John McGregor's first novel, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, was probably, he actually published it as a novel, but it was really short stories.
The American writer I was thinking of is called Elizabeth Strout.
Yes.
Like Sprout, only Strout. And she won the Pulitzer Prize for that collection. But Polly Sampson, English writer, has also done a collection of linked
Perfect Day.
She's a terrific
wonderful,
writer.
wonderful stories.
Never managed to write a full-length novel, but the linked short stories are very, very good.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are people like naturally more gifted than others at conveying information, or is it something that can be worked on for a couple of years? And do you have to come from an arts background to be good at?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
I think if you have been reading fiction with enjoyment and enthusiasm all your life, since you were a kid, then you already know 90% of what you need to know about writing a novel. On the other hand, if you haven't, if you've got to the age of 21 and you've only read 3 novels, forget it. It's like, you know, you can't start being a concert violinist at the age of 21, and you can't start being a professional footballer at the age of 21, and you can't start being a writer. You have to have done it, as most of us have, for the sheer pleasure of it, for the first, from the age of about 4 until you reach adulthood, and then you still have things to learn, but you know most of it already. So I don't think you don't have to come from an arts background, but you have to have done a lot of reading, I think.
Yeah.
Is this a question about creative writing?
Yes, because we need to answer the creative writing question.
If you're talking about learning for a couple of years.
Yeah, no, as in like obviously you said it takes people about 10 years, maybe 5 years.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what influences that length of time, and is it because they have a natural gift, or is it because of the background, they come from a literary background? Or?
Yeah, I don't think the literary background makes much difference at all. I think there are undoubtedly gifted writers and not gifted writers, but as Ken says, reading is so vital, and you know, surprisingly a lot of writers prefer to read their own work than, or potential writers prefer to read their own work than actually go out there and do a lot of reading. But there is the whole question of MAs now, which...
I'm really surprised nobody's asked that, you know, I mean, given that that is the sort of largest sort of growth area in the humanities in Britain, you know, and, you know, I occasionally meet sort of a biochemist in UCL who will say, why don't you teach creative writing? That'll bring them money in. I don't think people want to do English anymore, you know, I just want to do creative writing. They don't want to read, they want to write. Well, yes, but, you know, there's sort of connections. But
well, you have to be imaginative. And I imagine you're born with that. I don't know, but I imagine it's innate. And certainly as a child, I always lived in my imagination constantly. I was always a cowboy or a pirate or a captain of a spaceship. And obviously I still live in my imagination, you know, 10 hours a day I'm living in my imagination. And so that's clearly, you asked a question about an innate ability. I think that's part of it. And then you have to be more than averagely literate. You have to be able to take these fantasies that you live in and share them with other people, and that's a literary skill. That's about the use of words, and that's to some extent innate, and a great deal of that skill is learned. But it's certainly having all that. Certainly, I found when I started writing fiction that I still had a lot to learn, and I spent a long time writing not very successful fiction until finally I wrote till finally I wrote a good novel. It's called Eye of the Needle.
So what about the creative writing thing, Alexandra, as a publisher? Do you think has it made a big difference to what publishers publish?
Well, publishers, well, agents more, but agents and publishers go talent spotting, creative writing courses, so it's certainly a way of finding. Personally, I found the Arvin courses, those short ones, better, because you will have a well-known writer teaching, and if they're very struck by one of their students, they'll tell their agent or their publisher. When I worked at Virago, we found Pat Barker through Angela Carter. I found Maggie O'Farrell as an agent through Barbara Torpedo, and a new writer who we're going to publish next year, also through Barbara. Hilary Mantel found Marina Lewicka. There have been some marvellous couplings of older, more established writers finding young ones, and agents tend to go to the MAs to spot the talent. So I think from that point of view it's helpful. In terms of the work, I can't tell so much in the UK, but definitely in the US, the general standard of writing is higher. So you get more polished manuscripts of young American writers, but they're not necessarily the books that you really love. They're just better done. And it's that magic thing that I don't really know how to describe it. You know, a well put together novel doesn't necessarily do it for you. And you can sometimes, as Ken said, novels have, the joy of the novel is it's full of difficulties as well as being polished. They're very forgiving creatures, novels. And often the edges on them, the raw bits, make the difference. We give a special kind of spark to them. So the novels that are too well-rounded can be slightly off-putting. And I suspect that's happening in the UK, that there's a sort of, the standards going up a bit.
I think there are creative writing courses and there are creative writing courses. That's the other thing. You know, there are good ones and there are not good ones. And there's an argument there are too many.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should give some...
Excuse me, John.
Yes. Thanks, Ken. Thanks. Yes.
I was wondering about the pitfalls of trying to get published in the US. I was told consistently when I was working in publishing, and by many people who've been published since, that there really isn't much of a market for what I want to get published. And to be honest, I don't read much British fiction. I agree with what you said about US publishing, but is there anything obvious in terms of sort of getting around any objections that American agent or publisher might have about a UK author?
I think American agents are naturally suspicious if a British author sends a manuscript to them, because they immediately ask themselves, why haven't they found a British agent? And they're
something to preempt them to say, I'm influenced by American writers and this is something I've been told.
They'll still be suspicious.
They'll be very, very, very suspicious. They will think that that author has been turned down by every single agent in the UK. Because also, agents in the UK sell into the US. They either have people who do it for them or they do it themselves. So they're perfectly capable of doing it. So, you know, really, you always need to have your primary agent on your home territory.
And just, yes.
This is either for Luigi or Alexandra. So if you'd like to work at a literary agency and you don't have any contacts, what is the best way of doing that? Because I did a few internships and they literally asked me, so who are you related to?
You know, we've never done that. We have people working for us. We've just hired someone recently. I've never asked who are you related to or what.
I'm not saying everyone does, but in some places.
Well, I've never heard of that. I mean, I don't know whether you know that. No. All I would say is you have to have something to offer that literary agency, you know. So a knowledge of, in this particular case, a chap had been, you know, he graduated in MA in English at UCL. He was very keen to get published, and he couldn't get a job in any publishing house, and he did various internships, various publishing houses. And then somebody said to him, why don't you write a blog on crime novels, or something you like crime novels, write a blog. And so he wrote a blog called Crime and Publishing. That was his blog. And it was a review of crime novels, which he put up there himself, and he invited readers to submit, and this created a kind of snowball effect whereby publishers sent in their manuscripts to read, he would post reviews, and so he began to create a kind of presence for himself within that market. At the same time, we were looking for a young literary agent who showed initiative, who had a sense of commercial realities, so the fit worked. You know, that's how I think you have to have something to offer a literary agency.
Well, also, there is just something you go in right at the bottom, usually.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, my first job in book publishing was at Virago, and I was called the office slave, or the ship worker. And I spent my whole time typing invoices. In the old days, it was very old-fashioned typewriters, and going to the post, and just doing the accounts, and doing invoices, and that's how I started. It's a very long process. So most people just get a job as an assistant, and I know how hard it is. I'm interviewing for an assistant at the moment. We only posted the advertisement on our website, and we got 350 applications. So it's very tough.
Yes, sir.
I know there's been a few successes in the area, but how do you feel about self-publishing?
How do we feel about self-publishing?
Well, I think everybody, you know, if you've got something and you haven't managed to get anywhere with it, why not? I think it's fine. I think that, you know, it's much harder, but it doesn't stop you getting your book out. And some books take off from being self-published. I'm not against it. I'm slightly against just putting something on the web, just putting it up and thinking that people are going to read it. And I also think that self-published without being edited and without getting proper publicity and, you know, selling it properly is a bit of a waste of time, unless you're publishing it for your grandchildren or something. You know, I think that you have to be very professional about it if you're going to do it.
I mean, I think you hear in America, you know, there have been a certain number of authors who've had huge sales by self-publishing their novels. But I would, at the moment, I really would say that for every one author who has sold 1 million copies by self-publishing, there are 1 million authors who've sold 1 copy. And there are an awful lot of people out there posting their novels online, and they're badly edited. It's all about promotion. If you're going to do it that way, if you're going to self-publish, you've got to promote, because that's what the publishers do. They spend an enormous amount of money through the jacket, through marketing, through the relationship with the retailers, with the reviewers, all that work the publisher does. Now, if you're not going to have that, you've got to do it. And that means blogging, Facebook, Twitter, perhaps spending your own money on a PR campaign, because that's what publishers, they cost them to publish a book. You've got to think of it as a business. So, frankly, I would think twice about doing it before going down that route.
Was there a lady? Yes?
Oh, I was going to ask, like, given how many submissions agents and people get every day, what is it that makes, it's probably hard to quantify, but what is it that makes something really stand out amongst the crowd, you know, that grabs you immediately? And also, if in your synopsis, would you give away the end of the plot?
I think, like Alexandra said, the synopsises aren't everything. You know, more important is the writing, the first chapter, really the first chapter. What stands out is the idea, the plot. Does it grab you? I mean, it's interesting, that lighthouse, Australian lighthouse.
Have you heard about this thing?
I have just received it. I agree with you on that. I was quite stunned by how much it went for. However, the story, the plot, is a very traditional, conventional.
Very traditional. And you know what it's going to give you
exactly
from the first page.
With that plot, and you actually think, wow, it's not entirely original as a plot, but you do think you can immediately see people talking about it. You can see book clubs. You can see a lot of people thinking it's filmic. You know, it's got a plot device in it that's a very, very clever plot device, and therefore that's why it went. It doesn't really matter about the quality of the writing. I'm sure the writing was fantastic or not. That's a subjective
It's
thing.
so subjective.
It's so subjective.
I mean, that's the thing about
Can I just throw in this? I mean, I'm delighted that plot is, you know, plot's back. But I mean, something about the opening, which I can see from somebody in your position, especially Luigi, is really terribly important. Just from my experience of reading in one fell swoop 136 novels, admittedly perhaps most of them not perhaps as commercially intended as many of the things you dealt with. I mean, one really striking thing was how many novels there were which started really, really well. So you read that first chapter and you thought, what somebody like you must have thought, God, yes, okay. And how many novelists seem to be able to start a novel? I don't mean just the first page, but I mean the first perhaps 100 pages. And how few could end one? I mean, the endings were, but perhaps by that stage it's sold and it's, you know, and the reader's in. How few novelists can end a novel? I mean, it was amazing.
But as a reader, don't you find time and time again that endings are a problem? That endings can be disappointing so often. And you also know, I think you should apply what you think as a reader to your own writing. Because again, if you go into a bookshop, you often just read the first paragraph, don't you? You don't know the novel. You'll just look at the first few lines. So that is incredibly important. But I agree about endings.
I mean, I'm afraid, you'll probably say this is rubbish, but one of my daughters had to do an exam, and she had to do a maths exam, she had to do an English exam. One of the things they had to do was write a little story, and they had 20 minutes to do it. And she said, how do I write a good story? I said, well, it's really, you decide, this would be my advice, you see, probably it's bad advice, decide on the ending. Okay, decide on the ending. Okay, and as she was writing a little thing in 20 minutes, I said, decide on the last 2 sentences. Have those already. And when you see 5 minutes is left, get to those 2 sentences. But make sure you write those 2 sentences. Yeah? And she did bloody well in that exam. Yeah? Forget, those of you who've got kids, forget all that money on tutoring and things. That's how to do it, definitely.
The novelist John Irving says that he always knows his last sentence before he starts a novel. I've never ever come across that before, and his novels are pretty big, so...
Yeah. I think that's really important. I think it's a very, very good tip.
Interesting.
But it's so true that an awful lot of novels collapse halfway through.
But there are a lot of novels that you, this is the reverse of that take 100 pages to get into them. Captain Corelli's Manhunt is a really famous example of that. You have to slog through the first 100 pages and then you fall in love with it. And there are quite a few like that.
Today, though. I don't know.
There's a lady, please.
I write science fiction and fantasy. What's your advice for that sort of niche of the market? Because it's quite a niche, isn't it?
It is a niche. I think it's coming back. I think there's some indication that it's a very particular market, you know. But where it works, it can be huge, you know. And I think increasingly, I've heard of 2 publishers in the last month who've hired SF fantasy editors to set up new imprints, so that's an indication.
It's because I know that fan fiction is quite a big thing within that genre. Would you advise me to go down that road, or would you advise me to do more of my own thing, if you like, my own sort of original plots?
I don't know the market, so you'd have to take advice from somebody who's particular. And there aren't many agents who deal in this area of the market either. But in general, I would go with what you want to write. Don't follow the market, follow what you want to write.
Any other advice from the lady who's author?
I'm afraid I just don't know that market at all.
So it's obviously a very specific market then.
Well, the only thing I know about that, we published a novel that crossed over onto it. I mean, it's actually a very literary novel called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Yeah. And Susanna Clarke had written lots of stories, and there's a whole community of people who deal with the stories, and she caught the eye of Neil Gaiman, who really liked her stories and included them in an anthology. So when we came to publish her novel, he blogged about it, and he talked with her and so on, and that gave the book a huge lift, and it put it into that market as well as the literary market. Right. So I think the community of sci-fi and fantasy writing is quite a lot on the web, and stories are part of that. So
Sure,
that's my only experience of that. It's quite a good way of getting known. There are quite a lot of anthologies, I think. Yeah.
Thanks for your
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, is there a preferred length of book that you look for?
No. No.
Length.
I think if it's 200,000 words, some publishers will think twice about that.
Jonathan Strange and Mr.
But there aren't many.
Neil Gaiman books are blinking long, I can tell you. Yeah. So.
On the whole, I would say, I don't know, you can't be too prescriptive.
Do you think of yourself writing to a length at all, Joanna, ever?
No, but I'm wary if it goes too long. I think in my head it's going to be 80 or 90,000.
Yeah.
What's the minimum?
The minimum, I wouldn't write under 70, but that's personal.
I think that's right. Not, between 80 to 120,000 is a good model.
Mm.
Lady at the back.
What's your thought on Kindles and the non-paper books, and has it had any effect on the way people write? Obviously it's had an effect on the way people read and buy books.
I don't think it has any effect on it whatsoever. It's affecting people's reading patterns. And the sales are changing, and it's affecting the publishing industry, but I don't think it's affecting the writing side of it at all. The only thing, though, about what people buy most of all in terms of ebooks are genre fiction, crime in particular, and it tends to be fiction, and non-fiction much less so. So, but because the market in the UK at the moment is 4% ebook sales, it's so small, and it's in America it's 10%. We published the writer Anne Patchett, and in America apparently she was the #1 New York Times bestseller. About 50% of her sales were ebook sales, which I think is really, really interesting. And it's a completely gripping novel that you can't put down. So I think people use them for fiction reading, really. So if you want to go into that market, you go for fiction, but there's no sense in tailoring what you do to that market.
Yes, sir.
Can I take you slightly further down that point? I work in the record industry, which I imagine has certain parallels with the processes within publishing, and the worlds of online piracy and online sales are coming slightly later, obviously, to your industry, but I wonder how you see them affecting it.
It's not really a problem with books, because we'd learnt from the record industry. The record industry made the terrible mistakes, and it's very easy to take down the sites when piracy happens. And to be honest, not many people want to buy pirated books. I mean, you'd be looking at sort of J.K. Rowling or Stephanie Meyer or something. Most writers, they're very dedicated readers. And you're not going to, you get pirated books in India, and that's a big industry there, but it's a completely different market. But I can't really see it. Nobody's that bothered. Are you bothered, Luigi?
I don't know. We've had several instances of authors noticing their books on
But then they can be taken down.
They were taken down, but then they pop up a week later on another site. Or the people who've got the site put it back up again. Then you have to issue a letter of notice, a legal letter.
Yeah.
I mean, I do say I don't know how many people nick pirated books. I don't think authors, many readers do. Maybe a few. In the tens, hundreds, but not the thousands. I think I'm with you on that. The great majority of readers, I think, buy the books.
I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Okay. Now you've asked one already, Matt. Yeah. So lady at the back, and then you can bring the curtain down with a fantastic question at the end.
No pressure.
No pressure. No. Please.
If a publishing house was going to agree to pick on your book, how long would it be before you saw it on the shelf?
How long was it? Do you remember, Joanna? Between...
I can just say one thing, which is very simple, which is that you launch your book a year before you publish it. And so that there is always that year. And sometimes you shave a bit off. But also... At least, yeah, but usually you need to look at your entire publishing schedule. So, for example, we're full, our fiction list is full all through next year, and I have to say through most of the year after. So it depends on what
We've
slots
just sold
you
a
have.
novel last week, brand new author. and the publisher's given us a pub date for the first hardback on that book in summer 2013.
Yeah, that's how full we are too.
You know.
Please.
I was just wondering, you say you look at like the first 2 to 3 pages, and if that grabs you, might read the whole chapter. Do you usually get a chapter submitted and then you might ask for more chapters, or do people send you a whole manuscript and you fill out the rest?
We tend to send the normal convention 3 chapters, the 3 chapters.
And then you would ask for more.
Well, we get a lot of email submissions, so it doesn't really matter. We can send the whole novel, but we will.
What if you like the first 2 to 3 pages of the first chapter, and then you get the rest of it and it's kind of bad? I mean.
Then we get rid of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that? I think that's.
I mean, I think if it's really, if it's really good, we do work with authors. We do actively work with authors. So if it's not that the novel's got to be picture perfect for us. If the novel has got a lot of promise and the writing is good, then we will say, can I see more? How about this? Have you thought of doing that? You'd be really surprised, though, how many authors are resistant to editorial advice. And one thing I would say to you is, if you want to get published, now more than ever, you've got to take editorial advice. You cannot be super precious about your novel.
Can I just give? There's an example which I think is a peculiarly telling one, as it's a book that has been a huge seller over the years, over the decades, and was a book which was famously picked up from a slush pile in a way that probably wouldn't happen anymore. William Golding's Lord of the Flies, no definite article, and which has sold millions and millions of copies over the years. And of course, he was pretty much a middle-aged man when he finally got it published, and became more apparent. Any of you who've read Golding, read the biography by John Carey, makes it more apparent what happened. Absolute, if you read that novel, if you read the first couple of chapters, I reread it the other day. They are fantastic, and Golding was an amazingly talented writer, I think. Still, despite all the Nobel Prize, in many ways quite underrated, I think. And if you read the first 2 or 3 chapters of The Lord of the Flies, they are the most arresting and extraordinary chapters. But actually, old Charles Monteith, who discovered it, didn't just discover it. He said to Golding, no, scrap those. He had all these chapters which were about a war and described the war and battles and children being evacuated. And I don't know if you know the opening of Lord of the Flies. It opens on a beach in some island. And that was Charles Monteith. I mean, Golding wrote it all, but Charles Monteith told him what to leave in and what to take out, and a lot was taken out.
Max Perkins and Scott Fitzgerald, exactly the same. And these letters coming back from Fitzgerald to his agent, saying, I'm not happy with this, I don't want to do this, and effectively he did it. Yeah. He did it, and then the agent sold it, but they took editorial.
Yeah, well, Golding was so desperate. He was so desperate, he did exactly what he was told, and thank goodness. Anyway, I just want to thank my panellists, Luigi, Joanna and Alexandra.